something quiet has been happening beneath the surface of modern romantic life, and most men don't recognize it until they're already caught inside it. It doesn't announce itself. There's no single moment where everything breaks. Instead, it accumulates slowly, invisibly, like water pooling behind a wall you didn't know was cracking. A man meets a woman. The chemistry feels real. The connection seems mutual. He opens up. He invests. He makes himself available in ways he thought were supposed to matter. And then, without warning or explanation, the entire dynamic shifts. The warmth cools. The texts are slow. The respect he thought he'd earned evaporates. And he's left holding a question he can't answer. What did I do wrong? Most men ask that question with their faces turned outward. They review their behavior, their words, their timing. They wonder if they texted too much, called too soon, revealed too much emotion, or failed to perform some invisible ritual they were never taught. But the real question, the one that cuts deeper than any of those surface anxieties, is this: did he give away something he can't get back? Did he, in trying to prove his worth, accidentally demonstrate its absence? You can see it in the small things first. The way he checks his phone more often than he used to, the way he begins to adjust his schedule around her availability without her asking, the way he starts to soften his opinions in her presence, not because he's learned something new, but because he's afraid of friction, the way he begins to need her validation more than he needs his own clarity. None of this feels like submission at the moment. It feels like care. It feels like an investment. It feels like what love is supposed to look like. And that's precisely why it's so dangerous. Plato understood something about love that most men today have forgotten, or perhaps were never taught. Writing in 4th century Athens, observing the dynamics of desire and power in one of history's most psychologically sophisticated cultures, Plato didn't romanticize love the way we do now. He didn't see it as the ultimate destination or the highest validation of a man's worth. Instead, he saw love, particularly romantic and erotic, love as a force that could either elevate a man toward truth and self-mastery or drag him into delusion and self-abandonment. And the difference between those two outcomes had nothing to do with the woman. It had everything to do with whether the man understood what he was actually dealing with. By the end of this, you'll understand precisely why boundaryless love doesn't make you more connected. It makes you disposable. And you'll see, with surgical clarity, what happens to a man who mistakes emotional availability for strength. Plato lived in a world where men were expected to cultivate virtue, wisdom, and self-governance before they were considered fully human. Athens was a society built on the assumption that most people lived as slaves to their appetites. Food, sex, comfort, approval, and that true freedom required mastery over those forces, not indulgence in them. In The Republic and the Symposium, Plato outlined a vision of love that most modern men would find almost unrecognizable. He distinguished between base desire eros, aimed at physical beauty and immediate gratification, and higher love, which he saw as the soul's longing for truth, beauty, and the eternal forms beyond the material world. The former enslaves, the latter liberates, but only if the man knows the difference. Here is the thesis, and it will echo through every layer of what follows. A man who loves without boundaries does not become more attractive to a woman. He becomes invisible to her. Because love without structure, without limits, without a center of gravity outside the relationship is not perceived as generosity. It is perceived as a weakness, and no amount of emotional labor, vulnerability, or self-sacrifice will ever compensate for the absence of a man's self-respect. Plato would call this the tyranny of appetite. When a man allows his desire for a woman, whether sexual, emotional, or romantic, to become the organizing principle of his behavior, he stops acting from a place of sovereignty. He begins to react. He begins to negotiate. He begins to perform. And in doing so, he hands over the very thing that made him interesting in the first place, his autonomy. Consider the man who meets a woman and feels, for the first time in months or years, that rare combination of attraction and possibility. She's beautiful, she's intelligent, she laughs at his humor, she seems genuinely interested. And so he does what he's been told good men are supposed to do. He's attentive. He texts consistently. He asks about her day, her work, and her feelings. He makes time for her even when his schedule is already stretched. He shares his vulnerabilities, his fears, his past wounds because he's been taught that emotional openness is the currency of intimacy. And for a while it seems to work. She responds, she engages, she mirrors his investment. But then something shifts. The replies take longer. The enthusiasm dims. The plans become vague. And when he asks what's wrong, she says nothing's wrong. She's just busy, she's stressed, she needs space. So he gives her space. But space becomes distant. And the distance becomes silent. And eventually, he sees her with someone else. Someone who didn't text as much. Someone who didn't ask as many questions. Someone who didn't seem to care as deeply. And the man is left with a feeling he can't name. The feeling of having done everything right and still lost. What he doesn't see, what Plato would have seen immediately, is that he didn't lose because he cared too much. He lost because he stopped being a mystery. He stopped being a challenge. He stopped being someone whose attention was valuable because it was scarce, discerning, and rooted in something beyond her. He became a mirror that only reflected her. And a mirror, no matter how polished, is never the center of anyone's attention. It's a tool. And tools are only valued when they're needed. Or consider the man in a long-term relationship who slowly begins to feel the weight of invisible expectation. He works, he provides, he shows up, but somehow it's never quite enough. She's frustrated with him, though she won't say why. She's distant, though nothing explicit has changed. He tries harder, he initiates more conversations, he plans more dates, he asks what she needs. And she tells him she needs him to be more emotionally available, more present, more attuned to her feelings. So he does that. He opens up more. He shares more. He makes her emotional state his responsibility. And the result is not gratitude, it's contempt. Because what she was actually asking for, what she may not have even consciously understood, was not more availability. It was more boundary, more clarity, more evidence that he has a center of gravity that doesn't revolve around her mood. Plato would say she's testing whether he's ruled by appetite or by reason, whether he's a man who can hold his own shape under pressure or a man who melts into whatever form is demanded of him. This is not cruelty on her part. This is nature. This is instinct. This is the same pattern that has repeated itself across every human culture for thousands of years because it reflects fundamental aspects of attraction, respect, and reproductive strategy. A woman does not bond most deeply with the man who needs her approval. She bonds with the man who can lose her and remain intact. Now let's go inside the collapse, because this is where most men lose the thread. The process doesn't happen all at once. It occurs in stages, each one invisible until you're already inside the next. Stage 1 is the opening. The man meets the woman. The attraction is mutual. The early conversations feel effortless. He feels seen. She feels seen. She feels seen. There's laughter, curiosity, and sexual tension. Everything is light. And because it feels so natural, he assumes it will continue this way if he remains consistent, honest, and emotionally available. This is the first miscalculation. He mistakes the conditions of the beginning for the structure of the whole. But beginnings are not sustained by the same forces that created them. Beginnings run on mystery, on potential, on the gap between what is known and what might be. The moment that gap closes, the energy shifts. Stage 2 is the investment. The man begins to make himself more available. He texts more frequently. He prioritizes her in his schedule. He starts to think about her when he's alone, to imagine a future, to plan around her presence. And because modern culture has taught him that this is what love looks like, this attentiveness, this focus, this willingness to prioritize the relationship, he believes he's doing the right thing. But what he's actually doing is narrowing his world. He's reducing the number of projects, friendships, disciplines, and obsessions that existed outside of her. And in doing so, he's making himself less enjoyable. Not because he's boring, but because he's become predictable. He's become safe. And safety, while comforting, is not the same as desire. I work with men who describe this feeling as a kind of background hum, a low-level anxiety that wasn't there before. They check their phones more. They notice when she's online but hasn't replied. They start to interpret her tone, her word choice, and her punctuation. They begin to perform emotional labor they didn't know they'd signed up for. And the more they do this, the more they feel like they're losing ground. Because they are, every time they adjust their behavior to manage her perception, they move further from the man she was initially attracted to, and closer to the man she will eventually leave. Stage 3 is the negotiation. Something goes wrong. Maybe she cancels plans. Maybe she's cold after a conversation. Perhaps he mentions another man in a way that feels too casual. And instead of letting it sit, instead of allowing the discomfort to exist without rushing to resolve it, the man tries to fix it. He asks what's wrong. He apologizes even if he's not sure what he's apologizing for. He explains himself. He reassures her. He does everything he can to restore the equilibrium. And in doing so, he communicates something he doesn't intend to convey. That her approval matters more to him than his own boundaries. That he will negotiate his self-respect to keep her comfortable. Plato would call this the triumph of appetite over reason. The man is no longer acting from a place of clarity or self-governance. He's reacting to the pain of potential loss, and reaction by definition is not sovereignty, it's slavery. Slavery to the fear that if he doesn't perform correctly, if he doesn't manage her emotions skillfully enough, he will lose access to the thing he's come to depend on, her presence, her validation, her affection. But here's the trap. The more he negotiates, the less he is respected. And the less he is respected, the less he is desired. And the less he is desired, the more he negotiates. It's a spiral with only one destination. I once spoke to a man who described this dynamic with brutal clarity. He said, "I knew I'd lost when I realized I was apologizing for things I didn't believe I'd done wrong, just to stop her from being upset with me." He wasn't a weak man. He was a successful professional in good shape and socially competent. But somewhere in the relationship, he'd crossed a threshold he couldn't name. He'd started to make her mood his responsibility. And once he did that, he stopped being a man she could lean on. Because how can you lean on someone who's already leaning on you? Here's what most men don't see. The woman is not doing this consciously. She's not running a strategy. She's not trying to manipulate or control. She's responding to what she feels. And what she feels when a man loses his center is a kind of quiet revulsion. Not hatred, not anger, just a lack of respect that makes desire impossible. And once that respect is gone, no amount of effort will bring it back, because respect is not earned through performance. It's earned through presence, through the ability to remain unmoved by emotional weather, through the willingness to let her feel what she feels without making it your emergency. The man she later pursued, the one who seemed to barely notice when she was upset, who didn't apologize for his schedule, who never once asked, "Are we okay?" wasn't less caring. He was centered somewhere else. His life had a shape that existed before her and would continue after her. And that shape was more attractive than any amount of attentiveness could ever be. Now zoom out. This is not just a story about individual men and women. This is a symptom of a culture that has systematically dismantled every structure that used to protect masculine development. Plato wrote in a time when men understood that freedom required discipline, that desire required boundaries, that love required hierarchy, not between people, but within the soul. The rational mind was meant to govern the appetites. Courage was meant to enforce the will of reason. And only when those forces were aligned could a man love without losing himself. But modern life has inverted that order. We've been taught that boundaries are oppressive, that hierarchy is toxic, that discipline is rigid. The highest virtue is openness, availability, and emotional fluidity. And so men enter the sexual marketplace with no map, no framework, no understanding of the forces they're dealing with. They're taught to be vulnerable, but not how to protect that vulnerability. They're trained to pursue women, but not how to remain centered when they catch them. They're taught that love is about giving everything, but not that sharing everything is the fastest way to become nothing. The dating market punishes this confusion with ruthless efficiency. Apps reduce men to a swipeable image and a few lines of text. Social media creates the illusion of infinite options, but commitment feels like a cage. Attention is the new currency, and the men who give it too freely find themselves with nothing left to trade. Meanwhile, the risks have never been higher. A misread signal can become a public accusation. A relationship that ends badly can become a professional liability. A man who commits too early, too deeply, or to the wrong woman can lose not just his time and money, but his children, his home, and his reputation. And so, quietly, millions of men are making a different calculation. Not because they hate women, not because they've given up on connection, but because the environment no longer rewards masculine initiative, it punishes it. And punishment, repeated often enough, creates withdrawal. Plato would recognize this as the behavior of a rational soul trying to survive in an irrational system. When the cost of engagement exceeds the reward, disengagement is not a weakness, it's mathematics. But here's what gets lost in that withdrawal. The system is broken, yes, but the man who lets the system define him is still losing. Because walking away from a rigged game is only the beginning. The real question is, what does he walk toward? If he withdraws into comfort, into distraction, into passive consumption of content and pleasure, then he's chosen a slower form of the same collapse. He's still ruled by appetite. He just redirected it. If a system demands your vulnerability but offers no protection, walking away isn't cowardice, it's clear. But clarity without direction is just paralysis in better lighting. Here's the cost of staying blind to this pattern. The man who doesn't understand what Plato saw will spend years cycling through the same confusion. He'll meet women, feel the spark, invest deeply and watch it dissolve. He'll blame himself. He'll blame her. He'll blame her. But he'll never see the structure underneath, which is this. He's trying to build intimacy without sovereignty. He's trying to be chosen without first being complete. And that's not a strategy, it's a plea. Over time, this erodes him. Not all at once, but steadily. He becomes smaller, more bitter, more cynical. He starts to believe that relationships are inherently unfair, that women are impossible to satisfy, and that love is a transaction he can never win. And in a sense he's right, because the version of love he's been taught to pursue is a transaction. It's a negotiation in which he offers his time, attention, and emotional labor, and hopes she'll offer hers in return. But real attraction doesn't work that way. Real attraction is the byproduct of a man who has something more compelling to do than win her approval. She doesn't kill your purpose, she reveals its absence. What does integration actually look like? Not in theory, not in philosophy, but in the texture of a man's daily life. First, notice when you begin to adjust your behavior to manage her perception of you. This is the threshold. This is the moment where sovereignty ends and performance begins. It doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like care, like attentiveness, like being a good partner. But watch what happens in your body when you do it. Is there a subtle tightness in your chest? A low-level anxiety? Do we need to check if it worked? That's the signal. That's an overriding reason. And the correction is not to become cold or withholding. The correction is to stop, breathe, and ask, what would I do if I weren't afraid of losing her? Second, stop pretending that emotional openness is the same as intimacy. Intimacy requires vulnerability, yes, but vulnerability without discernment is not intimacy, it's exposure. And exposure without respect is just a wound waiting to be exploited. Plato would say, share your debts with those who have earned access to them, not with those who ask. The question is not whether she wants to know you. The question is whether she has demonstrated the capacity to honor what you reveal. Third, protect your mission as if your life depends on it, because it does. Not your survival, your vitality. The gym routine, the side project, the craft, the discipline, the friendships that existed before her, the time alone that makes you sharper. These are not distractions from love. They are the foundation of it. A man who abandons his mission for a woman does not become more valuable to her. He becomes a weight, and eventually she will resent him for the very sacrifice he thought would prove his love. Fourth, allow her to react. When you set a boundary, weigh no, and refuse to rearrange your life to accommodate her mood, she will have a response. Sometimes it will be anger, sometimes it will be anger, sometimes disappointment, sometimes silence, and your instinct will be to fix it, to explain, to soften the boundary so she feels better. Don't. Let her think what she feels. Let the discomfort exist, because it's not a sign that you've done something wrong. It's a sign that you've done something real. And real is what builds respect, even when it's uncomfortable. Fifth, move through the world as if you've already lost her, not with bitterness, not with detachment, but with the quiet understanding that her presence in your life is not a given, that she could leave tomorrow, the relationship could end next week, and that if it did, you would be sad, yes, but you would not be destroyed because your life has a shape that does not depend on her choosing to stay. This is not indifference, this is freedom, and freedom is the only soil in which genuine love can grow. Now imagine two futures. In the first, you ignore everything you just read. You continue to pursue connections the way you've been taught. You invest early and deeply. You make yourself available. You prioritize her comfort over your clarity. And for a while it might even work. She might stay. She might say she loves you. But over time you'll notice the signs, the lack of desire, the subtle disrespect, the way she stops asking for your opinion, the way she makes decisions without you, the way other men seem to command her attention in ways you no longer can. And you'll tell yourself it's fine, that relationships mature, that passion fades, that this is just what commitment looks like. But in the quiet moments, alone in your own head, you'll know the truth. You've traded yourself for access, and access is not intimacy. It's just permission to stay close to someone who no longer sees you. In 5 years, you'll be smaller, be more careful, more resentful. You'll have learned to avoid conflict, to manage her emotions, and to perform the rituals of connection without any substance. And you'll look at younger men with a kind of tired cynicism, thinking they don't know yet. They don't know that none of it matters. But what you'll really mean is, I don't know how to do this differently. I don't know how to love without losing myself. And so I've decided that losing myself is just the price. In the second future, you take this as an initiation. You see the pattern Plato saw, and you refuse to repeat it. You build your life around a mission that matters more than any single relationship. You train your body, you sharpen your mind, you cultivate friendships with men who hold you accountable. You learn to sit with discomfort instead of rushing to resolve it. You stop performing, you stop negotiating, you stop apologizing for things you don't believe you did wrong. And when you meet a woman, you meet her from a place of completeness, not need. You offer your presence, but not your center. You share your world, but you don't abandon it. And if she leaves, let her go. Not because you don't care, but because you understand that a woman who cannot respect your boundaries was never going to respect you. In 5 years, you'll have fewer people in your life, but the ones who remain will be real. You'll have more clarity and less noise. You'll have walked through the loneliness of self-construction and come out the other side with something that can't be taken from you, the knowledge that you belong to yourself. And that will change the way women respond to you, not because you're performing some new strategy, but because you've stopped performing altogether. You've become the kind of man whose attention is valuable because it's rare, discerning, and rooted in something larger than desire. The path of sovereignty is more challenging. It's lonelier at first. It requires you to say no to things that feel good in the moment, but hollow you out over time. It requires you to tolerate being misunderstood. It requires you to let go of people who were never really there in the first place. But it's the only path that preserves the one thing you can't afford to lose, your self-respect. Here's the thesis one more time, in the plainest language possible. A man who loves a woman more than he loves his own clarity will eventually be despised by both. She doesn't kill your purpose. She reflects its absence. The moment you make her the center of your life is the moment you lose the one thing that made you worth choosing in the first place. Plato knew this. Every ancient tradition knew this. And the men who survived the chaos of modern dating without losing themselves know it too. The question is, will you learn it in time, or will you spend the next decade proving it the hard way? If this hits something in you, if you recognize yourself in these patterns, then share it with the men in your life who need to hear it. Subscribe, not for me, but for the work itself. Keep this alive for the man who's 1 week, 1 month, 1 year behind you, walking the same path you just walked, wondering why nothing makes sense. That's the work. That's the inheritance. That's what we owe each other. Love is not the enemy. Boundaryless love is. And the difference between the two is the difference between a man who builds his life around a woman and a man who invites a woman into a life he's already built.